Hello everyone, this is Kerry from Your Level Best, and today I'm going to be making pizza. Good pizza that just happens to be gluten-free. This is different than pizzas that are typically made with gluten-free flour. Now, this is not to say that a lot of recipes out there for gluten-free pizza are bad. They're not bad. They're very different than the pizza we all know and love. And you've probably, if you've lived gluten-free for long enough, have served one of the gluten-free pizza crust recipes to your family and friends. And typically they say something to the effect of, well, this is good gluten-free pizza, which usually means it's still missing something. So what I'm going to show you today is a recipe for pizza that's really good, that your family and friends will not say, oh, that's good gluten-free pizza. They're going to say, this is good pizza. So it's going to be a little bit different than making pizza with regular wheat flour, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make when they're doing gluten-free cooking, especially bread making and pizza making, is they assume that you do the same with gluten-free flour that you do with wheat flour. And actually, what I'm going to show you today is totally different. So, I'm going to show you the method. This is actually the America's Test Kitchen gluten-free pizza recipe that I'm going to show you. And I've made some tweaks to make it a little bit more for how we use it here in our household. And I want to say one thing before I get started on the recipe. If you're a person that says, well, I'm eating gluten-free because it's healthier, please stop. If you can eat regular wheat-based pizza, please do. It's actually healthy, it's fine, it's not going to hurt you, there's nothing wrong with gluten. Really, if you're eating gluten-free, it should be because you have celiac disease, or in my case, gluten intolerance. So don't think that this is healthier. It's not healthier for you. It's just missing a protein called gluten that is in wheat flour, and there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't hurt you. So I'll get off my soapbox, but please, if you can eat regular pizza, go ahead and make regular pizza. It actually takes less time to make regular pizza than it does this recipe. However, if you want to see a gluten-free pizza that is really good that you can feed to your family and friends, stay tuned. I'll show you how this works. So, I will admit this recipe will take you a little while. So if you're gonna make this, what I like to do is make a big pizza ahead of time, and I freeze it so that when I want a piece of pizza, I don't have to go through this every time I want pizza. So this will take a little while. I would say a lot, 3 to 4 hours in your day, because there's some rising, there's some par baking, there's some different steps that you have to do in order to make this pizza. But I'm going to say it is so worth it, and I will talk you through a couple of things that you can do, that you can make a lot of this ahead of time, and then you can make your pizzas when you want. So let me go over the ingredients in front of me. Now, you're going to see a few things. Number one, I have the gluten-free flour mix. This is America's Test Kitchen all-purpose gluten-free flour mix. This recipe I've linked on the website, on the blog, so you can actually download how to make this. It's actually pretty simple. There are flours, there are ratios of flours that you can get at any store these days, like white rice flour, brown rice flour, potato starch, tapioca starch, milk powder. Those are what make up this particular gluten-free flour blend. And what this is a balance of starches and proteins. So it more closely mimics the makeup of wheat flour, but again, it doesn't work the same as wheat flour, and I'll show you how different it is. So you want to make sure when you make this, weigh out your flour. Don't use your measuring cups. The recipe actually calls for weighing out your flour, and the reason why you want to weigh out your flour, now this is actually something that you should do even if you make wheat-based recipes. Weighing out your flour will guarantee that you have the same amount of the ingredients every time. So when you do a measuring cup, and you notice that in some wheat-based recipes they say you want to do the same type of scooping to get a more consistent scoop, it's better if you weigh the flour. So this flour is actually done by weight. So I have this weighed out here. This is about 16 ounces of the all-purpose gluten-free flour mix. I also have here some almond flour. This actually adds the extra protein you need to make a pizza crust. So I've got some almond flour right here. I've also got some olive oil. I've got some warm water. I've got some baking powder. Now we are using yeast, and you can see I have some yeast here. We are using yeast. However, with gluten-free flours, a lot of times a little extra lift is necessary, and that's why we are also using some baking powder in this recipe. There's also some salt. And the last thing I wanted to go over is something called psyllium husk powder. And the reason being, one of the things that you have to do with gluten-free flours for baking is provide structure. Now, if you've ever done any gluten-free baking, the typical binder that is used to provide structure is something called xanthan gum. Now, xanthan gum is good. Now, I don't want to say that you should never use xanthan gum. Xanthan gum is good if you're making cakes, you're making muffins, you're making cookies, you're making smaller baked goods that can be a little crumbly. Like you expect a piece of birthday cake, for example, to be, a tender crumb and a little bit crumbly. That's okay. You expect that out of a birthday cake. But I can tell you from, and this is actually buying a sandwich, for example, from a gluten-free bakery. I know there's one locally within a half an hour of here that made a beautiful gluten-free sandwich bread. I mean, it tasted good, it looked good, it had the texture. But because they use xanthan gum, I would take a bite out of the sandwich and the bread would crumble in my hands. I'm sorry, but I don't want to, use a piece of bread and it crumbles. It's not worth it. It takes the fun out of eating gluten-free bread. So I'm actually using something called psyllium husk powder. Now, America's Test Kitchen was the one that actually found this particular binder through their testing. And one of the reasons I like using their recipes is they spend all the time testing. I don't have to try and figure all this out. So what they did is they found psyllium husk powder. Now, if you're going, what the heck is that? Psyllium husk powder is better known as a certain brand of laxative that starts with an M. And I'm sure you will start thinking, oh, wait a minute, it usually is orange flavored. So that's actually the main ingredient in that type of laxative. And before you go out and buy the laxative version, I'd say don't, just because there's a lot of other stuff that's in there, not bad stuff, but there's other ingredients in those particular powders that you don't want in your bread. So if you want to find plain psyllium husk powder, you can go to a natural food store. Some grocery stores are now carrying it, but a natural food store, I actually have to check in the vitamin section because a lot of times it is used as a laxative. So don't worry, we're not using enough here to provide a laxative effect. But what psyllium husk powder does as a laxative that makes it so wonderful is it binds stuff up and it actually helps things pass in your digestive system. And that particular binding is great for bread. It actually acts very similar to gluten. So when you bite into that piece of bread, if you use a recipe with psyllium husk powder, it doesn't crumble. And it was so wonderful after I made this for the first time to eat the pizza, and it stayed together and it tasted good and it provided that structure. So you definitely want psyllium husk powder. Now it also works in cakes and cookies, but it gives a very earthy taste. So if you don't want that taste in your cakes and cookies, I wouldn't recommend using it. But for breads, it's the taste matches what you're trying to make. So that's about the ingredients here and a little bit about gluten-free baking. Let's go ahead and get started making this crust. So what I'm going to do, I've got my mixing bowl here. I'm going to add to the mixing bowl my gluten-free flour, my baking powder, the salt, and the yeast. Now this is a little bit different than a wheat-based recipe. A lot of times you add the yeast to the warm water and let it proof. You don't need to do that here. I'm going to also add the psyllium husk powder. And I'm going to add the almond flour. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and put this in my mixer. And I'm just gonna go ahead and give this a quick mix. So, let me lock this down here. And I'm putting this on stir so that it will actually mix everything up. So it'll take just a minute. Now, one of the things that you're gonna notice is you're not going to need anything. One of the things that you typically do with a wheat-based flour crust is you mix all the dry ingredients and then you add your wet ingredients, usually with the yeast already proofed, and then you knead it. You will do no kneading here. This will actually be more like a cookie dough. And that may freak you out a little bit, but here's the reason. You want this to be a little wetter because the starches, the grains that you're using as part of your flour do not hydrate as quickly as wheat-based flours do. So you're going to see in a minute how exactly we make sure that it's thoroughly mixed, because you definitely don't want pockets of stuff that doesn't get mixed in, because that won't hydrate. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my olive oil, and you can use vegetable oil too, and I'm going to add it to the water. So I'm going to keep this on low speed, and I'm just going to drizzle this in. So you're going to see it's going to look pretty wet at first. And there we go. It's almost there. So I'm going to stop this. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this on medium speed for 6 minutes. And what that's going to do is hydrate the flour. Everything's going to thicken up a little bit. And I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Okay, it's been 6 minutes. Now, I did this with a mixer with a paddle attachment. So one thing I want to recommend if you're doing gluten-free baking, you definitely want to have a strong mixer, because the doughs that you're going to make are more like a strong, very thick cookie batter. And I can tell you, a cheap mixer is not going to cut it. It's going to get overpowered really quickly, and it's not going to get what you want. So I did this for 6 minutes, and you'll notice it's a very thick cookie dough like consistency when you're done. Because at first it looks a little wet and oh my gosh, what happened? But then after the 6 minutes, it's very well mixed, it's incorporated, it looks like, you know, cookie dough. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just give this a good scrape. And then I'm going to cover this with plastic wrap, and I'm going to put this in a warm place for 90 minutes. So I'm going to let this rise. Like any bread dough, you want to let it rise because yeast does provide some of that lift. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to cover this with plastic wrap. I've got that right here. And then I will show you what it looks like after 90 minutes. See you in a minute. Hello everyone and welcome back. It's been 90 minutes and the dough is ready. So I'll show you a close-up of what the dough is supposed to look like. You're probably saying, okay, well, how do I know that this type of batter has risen enough? So what you'll see is that you take a spoon and you just gently lift some of the batter up. And you should see bubbles in there. If you don't see bubbles, let it rise for a little bit longer, but you should see bubbles there, as you can see in the close-up. So next, what we're going to do is actually get this into the pan and make our dough. So what I'm going to do now is I'll take the plastic wrap off the container here, and I'm going to bring over a pan. This is actually a large sheet pan that I have here. And let me pull this back a little so you can see it. So it's a large sheet pan, and this is where I differ a little bit from the America's Test Kitchen version of this recipe. They like to do 2 11-inch rounds, which not something I want to do. They're a pain in the butt to do, so I find it easier to use a square, just a square pan of the size you like. And depending on the size, like if there was a pan that was bigger than this, you'd get a less doughy crust. like it'd be more of a thin crust. Use a smaller one, you have more of a thick crust. And I actually like a thicker crust on my pizza, so I have a medium-sized baking sheet here in front of me. Now, it's got a piece of parchment paper on it that's been lightly greased. And so what you want to do is, let me grab my spatula here, is you want to take the dough and scrape it out of your container here. And then get it fairly well centered onto the baking sheet. So the next thing you want to do is, I've got here a piece of plastic wrap. Now this plastic wrap has been coated in cooking spray, so everything's been well greased. So I'm going to give you a close-up of how this works, because what you're going to do is actually use your hands, and with the greased sheet here, the plastic sheet, you're going to be able to move the dough around. Let me give you a close-up of that so you can actually see how this works. Okay, now that you have a better vantage point, so what I'm going to do now is you're going to see me just spread the dough. Now, the plastic wrap will not necessarily cover every bit of it, so you may have to move it around. Like in this case, I'm going to first really work the center of the dough, because I want it to get everywhere. I want it to get out to the edges of this pan, and there's plenty of dough, trust me. So you'll notice it's starting to travel to the edges of the pan. Without the plastic wrap, you'd never get it to where you wanted it. So again, you're just watching me get this to the edges of the pan. And we're almost there. I'm almost the way I like it. And yes, this is a little bit tougher to do than necessarily a gluten crust, but it will actually yield the same results, because what you want, and I'm gonna patch a hole there because it got a little thin, what you want is a crust that's got that chewiness in it. And you can see I have an edge, and there is the shaped crust. And I'll get rid of the plastic wrap. Now the crust is shaped, it's ready to actually be par-baked. And what I'm doing here is essentially drying out the crust and partially cooking it. And the reason why you do that is because this is a gluten-free crust, you want to make sure that it's cooked enough so that, you know, when you put your sauce and toppings onto it, it actually, you know, doesn't turn into a soggy mess. If we did all this now, kind of like a wheat-based crust, it would not cook underneath. It would actually turn into a mushy mess. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to place this in an oven, and it's turned off right now. This is kind of the weird part, is you actually put this in the oven at 325. You turn the oven on when you put this in, and you bake it for 45 minutes. Now the reason you turn the oven on after you go ahead and put the crust in there is it slowly bakes the crust. So you want it to be a slow baking process. If you did it too quickly, it would not bake properly. So I'm going to put this in the oven. I'm going to turn it on to 325 degrees, and I'm going to cook this for 45 minutes, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Hello everyone, and welcome back. The crust has par-baked for 45 minutes, and I'll give you a close-up of what this looks like. You'll see that it's actually light in color, so it's not dark, it's not cooked fully yet, because what we want to do is let this cool and top it with the stuff that we want and bake it at a very high temperature so you get that crisp crust and that chewy center that we all love about pizza. But one thing I want to note is, let's say you want to make your pizza later. Like, you want to do this on another day, you want to do this next week with your friends, but you don't have the time to make the crust the day you want to make pizza. So you can take this crust the way it is right now, let it cool, wrap it in plastic wrap, and then foil, and then stick it in the freezer and freeze it. So then you can thaw it out. You can put your toppings on, throw it in the screaming hot oven, and make your glorious pizza. So that way you can spend the time that it takes to make this on another day when you have more time, and then you can bake it off when you're ready to eat it, which doesn't take very long at all. So what I am going to do is I'm going to let this cool, and then we're going to top the pizza and finish this off. So see you in a minute. Okay, everybody, welcome back. The crust has cooled, and now I've got my ingredients for the toppings. Now, the way that I do this is both tomato-free and also healthy. So you're not going to see any pepperoni on here or any salted meats or anything, but the combination that I've come up with for our pizza toppings is very healthy, but it also tastes really good because, quite frankly, who wants to eat a piece of pizza that tastes like garbage? So let me go over what I put on my pizza. And by the way, you can check all the health stats on our blog post, but it's for 10 pieces. So this size pizza actually makes 10 pieces, and they will be 273 calories per serving. So that's not a whole heck of a lot, but that's only for one piece. So make sure that if you want to include this pizza in your healthy diet, that you only have one piece. And then I usually eat some vegetables alongside of it, or a salad, something small, but I usually only have one piece of pizza when I'm going to have it. So here are the ingredients that I'm going to top the pizza with. I've got some chicken that I've cubed and cooked. I've got some onion, some red bell pepper, of course some mozzarella cheese. You can't have pizza without mozzarella cheese. I also have some spinach, and then to make this tomato free, there are white pizzas out there. You can just use olive oil, you can use all kinds of different things for your sauce. And what I like to use is a combination of Greek yogurt, garlic, oregano, and a little bit of salt. And what that does is it actually, when it cooks down a little bit, it's still creamy, but it has a little more tang. It almost tastes a little like an extra dimension of cheese. So if you like putting feta on your cheese, it reminds me a little bit of feta or maybe a creamy goat cheese, but it gives it that extra dimension after it cooks. So I'm going to zoom in and show you how I top this pizza. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and top my pizza. I have the pizza actually on an overturned baking sheet. It just makes it easier to get in and out of the oven. So just make sure, there you go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on my sauce, and I'm going to spread it around. It's actually quite thick, so I'll just have to spread this around a little bit. It takes just a second, but you can see all that garlic. And I'm not using a lot because if you know anything about making pizza, you don't want pizza that has too much sauce on it, because when there's too much sauce on it, you can actually make it really soggy. So I don't think this would actually sog out the crust necessarily, but it's always good to use a little bit less when you're topping your pizza, because when there's too much in there, you end up soggy crust. And that's no good. What's the point of eating pizza if the crust is soggy? Okay, so now I'm going to take some mozzarella cheese and top this really well. Get this all over, and I just shredded an 8-ounce block of mozzarella cheese, you know, pure and simple. You're better off just getting a block of cheese and taking a few minutes and actually shredding it yourself, because then you don't end up with the fillers that are in pre-shredded cheese. However, if you like pre-shredded cheese, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using it. You just end up with extra fillers in your cheese to keep it shredded like that. So I've got my cheese here. So I'm going to put down my onions. And I like a lot of onions on my pizza, because I can tell you, when I was in college, when I could still eat regular store-bought pizza, my favorite toppings, when they actually had a $5 deal next to the college campus, they had a $5 2-topping deal for your pizzas. And my favorite toppings were pepperoni and onions. And oh my gosh, when those onions got caramelized in the oven, oh my gosh, it was so good. And I still love onions on my pizza to this day because they add an extra dimension. So now I'm also going to use my red bell pepper. So you see, most of what I'm putting on here are vegetables. You know, this is not a meat-heavy pizza, but I've still got meat that I'm putting on this pizza. But when you use mostly vegetables, you can add all kinds of flavor and not too many calories, because what you don't want to do is make your pizza to be a greasy, calorie-laden mess. So if you use a lot of cured meats, not to say that pepperoni is the worst thing in the world, but if you want to keep your sodium down and you want to, you know, have a fairly healthy pizza, you definitely want to use more vegetables. I'm also going to put on here some spinach, and I'm using quite a bit because I love spinach, and it does cook down fairly quickly in the oven. So I'm just going to put some right here, and it gives a beautiful taste. So, and notice that I'm not cooking this, because what I found when I cook the spinach ahead of time, it gets really moist and it doesn't work real well. Then finally I'm going to top this with the chicken that I've just cooked. And I'm using boneless, skinless chicken breast because it will, you know, add a lot of flavor to the pizza, but it won't add a lot of fat and calories. And what you don't want to have is, you know, meat that's highly fatted with a lot of sodium in it, because when you make this yourself, you can control everything that goes in it, and it turns out beautifully. And you notice I got a lot of veggies that are, you know, there's a lot of volume on this, but I like a lot of toppings. It always tastes good to me, and I love when I bite into the pizza. And actually, it does come down a little bit, so it's not like, you know, it's going to be piled sky high. So getting the chicken on the pizza, trying to keep it in the center so it doesn't go all over the place here, because the cheese is going to glue everything together. So, and this chicken is just barely cooked to temperature. I don't want, especially if I'm going to stick something in the oven like this, I don't want the chicken overcooked, so I don't cook it too much. So there we go. We've got our pizza topped, and what I'm going to do is put this in a 550-degree oven, actually on some pizza stones, and they're actually stone tiles that unglazed stone tiles that I've used from your big box home improvement store that work just as well. But if you have a pizza stone, you want to do that. You want to get it into the oven, 550 degrees, and warm those up for an hour, and then go ahead and slide in your pizza. So I'm going to go ahead and slide in my pizza. It'll probably take 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll show you the finished product. Oh my goodness. Welcome back. The pizza is done, and oh my gosh, does it look really good. You can see there's crust, and you can hear it. This is crispy crust that you can only get on a pizza that's been done on a pizza stone or even on a grill. And the chicken is brown, the cheese is all bubbly, the spinach has definitely cooked down, and oh wow, this looks great. So I hope you give this a try. This is a 10-serving pizza, so I'm gonna let this cool off, and the way that I do this is I'll cut it up into the 10 servings. I will wrap each piece in plastic wrap, and then those pieces into foil so that they can last in the freezer for a little bit. So I hope you give this a try. This is good pizza that just happens to be gluten-free. So serve this to your friends. Don't tell them it's gluten-free. It'll be our little secret, and I bet you they'll be like, wow, this is good pizza. And that's a marker for when a gluten-free pizza is actually pizza that everybody loves. So I hope you give this a try. I know it'll take a little bit of time to make, but it's so worth it. Please subscribe, check out our blog. I have all the recipes and everything, including a recipe for the sauce that I used for this particular pizza. And I'll see you next time.